Everyone, and welcome to our deep dive, into the Bisha mine in
The
Eritrea.
Bisha mine.
Yeah, have you heard of it?
I have.
Okay, cool. So this is gonna be a fun one, because it's a mine, right? I
Oh,
mean, everyone loves a
yeah.
good mining story, but it's not just about digging a hole and finding gold this time.
It's not just about that, no.
It's got a little more intrigue to it, right?
It does. It really
Yeah.
does.
So we've got a whole stack of stuff to go through. We've got reports from mining journals, the kind of industry stuff.
Yeah.
And then we've got legal documents, like a whole bunch of them from a really big lawsuit that went down.
Oh, wow.
And then we've even got like some rumors, some whispers, of financial stuff going on behind the scenes.
Financial maneuvering always adds a layer of intrigue, doesn't it?
Exactly. It's like we're piecing together a puzzle here.
I love it. And I think what makes this deep dive so interesting is that it's not just, about the rocks and minerals. It's
Right.
really a story where money collides with international law and human rights.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it kind of makes you think about, like all the stuff we use every day.
Absolutely.
Even something simple like the copper in your phone. Right? It comes from somewhere.
It does. It has an origin story.
Yeah, and that origin story, can sometimes be pretty complicated.
Definitely not always pretty.
Yeah. So let's get started, and maybe we should start with the basics. Where even is Eritrea?
So Eritrea is a small country in East Africa. It's right on the Red Sea, kind of tucked away.
Okay, tucked away, got it.
Yeah, it's a bit of a hidden gem, geographically speaking.
Okay, in the Bisha mine, this mine that's causing all this drama. Where's that?
The Bisha mine is in the western part of the country.
Western part, okay.
Yeah, and initially it was all about the gold and silver.
Oh, so shiny stuff.
Exactly, the kind of stuff that gets people excited.
That gets investors excited.
Especially investors, and that's where Nevson Resources comes in.
That was
Yes, Nevson Resources, a Canadian mining company.
Yeah.
They saw the gold and silver and they were like, hey, there's potential here. But they also saw something else, huge deposits of copper and zinc just lying underneath.
This was like a bonus, a buried treasure.
Exactly like hitting the jackpot twice.
And what did they do with all that copper and zinc? I mean, those are pretty valuable too, right?
Oh, absolutely essential for all sorts of industries. But here's the thing about Nevsun. They were reporting amazing production numbers extending the mine's life. They were even talking about expanding the whole operation.
So on the surface, it sounds like a win-win, right? They're making money, the mine's doing well.
Right. It all seemed rosy, at least from the outside.
At least from the outside, what do you mean?
Well, remember those legal papers we talked about?
Yeah, the lawsuit stuff.
Exactly. That's where the cracks in the facade start to show.
Oh boy.
That lawsuit filed against Nevsun in Canada, the accusations are serious.
How serious?
We're talking forced labor, inhumane treatment, and even whispers of connections to crimes against humanity.
Whoa, hold on, that escalated quickly. So what exactly are they saying Nevson did?
Well, the lawsuit claims that Eritrean workers were forced to work at the Bisha mine against their will. They were facing threats and intimidation, just awful stuff.
So it wasn't just like hard work, it was like seriously bad conditions.
Oh, much worse than just hard work. The picture painted in that lawsuit is really grim.
And they're being sued in Canada. But this all happened in Eritrea, so how does that even work?
That's what makes this case so significant. It's setting a precedent. It could determine whether corporations can be held accountable for human rights violations no matter where they're operating.
So a Canadian company is being sued on their home turf for things that happen across the globe.
Exactly. And the implications are huge. It's like a legal earthquake shaking up the corporate world.
So how did Nevson respond to all of this?
Well, like most companies in their situation, they denied any wrongdoing. They tried every legal maneuver they could to get the case dismissed.
Like what?
Well, they argued that it should be heard in Eritrea, not Canada. They were basically trying to avoid responsibility.
Wow, so they're fighting this tooth and nail.
They definitely were. But the people who filed that lawsuit, they weren't backing down either.
So this was more than just a legal case. It was a fight.
Oh, absolutely. It was about holding a powerful corporation accountable for its actions.
And what about the Canadian courts? What did they say?
Well, the Canadian Supreme Court, in a landmark ruling, allowed the case to move forward.
Really?
Yes, and that sent shockwaves through the corporate world. Suddenly, companies realized they could be held responsible for human rights violations even in far-flung corners of the globe.
So it wasn't just about Nevson and the Bisha mine. It was a wake-up call for businesses everywhere.
Precisely. It set a new standard. It forced companies to take a hard look at their operations and supply chains, especially in countries with less than stellar human rights records.
That's a lot to unpack just from that one ruling.
It is, but it really underscores the power of the legal system to hold corporations accountable.
So let's dig a little deeper into these accusations themselves. What evidence did they present in the lawsuits?
Well, the evidence was pretty damning. It included first-hand accounts from workers backed up by reports from human rights organizations.
So real people, real stories.
Exactly. And some of those stories were truly chilling. Like, imagine workers being arrested straight from the mine site.
Arrested.
Yes, no due process, no transparency, just gone.
That sounds terrifying.
It is, and it really makes you question what was going on behind the scenes at the Bisha mine.
And did anything come out from Nevson's side? Like internally?
Interestingly enough, yes. Internal emails from Nevson started to surface, revealing concerns within the company about the use of forced labor and the difficulties of working within Eritrea's political landscape.
So they knew there were problems.
It certainly seems that way, and it raises serious questions about transparency and accountability.
It's like they were saying one thing publicly, but privately, they knew something was wrong.
That's the impression you get.
Yeah.
And it really adds to the complexity of this case.
And we even have names attached to some of these internal voices.
Yeah.
Right?
We do. Cliff Davis, the CEO at the time, figures prominently in these emails, along with others like Kerry Connor and Stan Rogers.
So this isn't just about some faceless corporation.
Exactly. It's about decisions made by individuals, by people in positions of power.
People with names and faces.
Yes, and the contrast between their public statements and those private anxieties is striking.
It makes you wonder what was going through their minds.
It does, and it really highlights the human element in all of this.
Okay, so we've got this intense legal battle, serious accusations, and some inner turmoil within the company. What happened next?
Well, the lawsuit was eventually settled, but the details of the settlement are shrouded in secrecy.
A secret settlement.
Yes, very hush-hush. And then, as if on cue, a new player enters the scene. Zijin Mining, a Chinese company.
Zijin Mining.
Yes, they swooped in and acquired Nevsun, taking over the Bisha mine.
So what happens now? Did they inherit any of the baggage from the Nevsun lawsuit?
That's a good question, and one that's difficult to answer definitively. The details of the acquisition and whether any liabilities related to those human rights allegations were transferred are unclear.
So we don't know for sure if Zijin Mining is on the hook for anything that happened before.
We don't, and that lack of transparency is troubling. It raises questions about whether anything has really changed at the mine.
It sounds like this is just the beginning of the story.
Oh, it definitely is. The Bisha mine saga is far from over.
This is getting good. I can't wait to hear what happens next.
Me too. This is where things get really interesting.
Well, let's take a closer look at the heart of the issue, those accusations of forced labor. But before we do that, let's hear from our sponsors.
That's good.
We'll be right back. Okay, so we're back and ready to really get into the human side of this whole thing. You know, those worker testimonies.
Yeah, those are really powerful and disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, reading through them, it paints a really grim picture of what those workers went through.
It does, and it's important to remember these aren't just abstract legal arguments, you know? These are real people sharing their experiences, their suffering.
Yeah, so what were they saying? What were some of the things that stood out to you?
Well, there was a recurring theme of desperation. You know, a sense of being trapped in a system that offered no way out.
Oh, man, that's heavy.
It is, and one worker talked about being forced to work these incredibly long shifts, like 12 hours a day, 7 days a week.
12 hours a day.
Yeah, in scorching heat. Imagine that, with minimal breaks and just barely enough food and water to survive.
Oh my gosh, that's inhumane.
It is, and he also talked about this constant fear of punishment. You know, if they didn't meet their quotas or if they questioned anything, they could be detained or beaten.
It sounds like a prison camp, not a workplace.
Yeah, that's the feeling you get reading these testimonies. And another worker, a young woman, described being separated from her family for months at a time.
Oh, wow.
Forced to live in these overcrowded and unsanitary barracks. It's just awful.
It's heartbreaking. And the psychological toll of that, you know, being constantly monitored and controlled, having no freedom.
That's what really gets to you reading these accounts, the sense of hopelessness.
So did any of the workers try to speak out or resist?
Some did, but the consequences were severe.
Like what kind of consequences?
Well, some workers who tried to voice their concerns or even escape were allegedly detained, tortured, or even disappeared.
Disappeared.
Yeah, it's chilling. And it created this climate of fear where people were too afraid to speak up for fear of retaliation.
So they were basically stuck with no options, no way out.
That's the tragic reality of it, and it makes you question how a company like Nevsun, operating in this day and age, could be involved in something so horrific.
Yeah, I mean, a Canadian company, a country known for its human rights standards.
Exactly. It really challenges our assumptions about corporate social responsibility and where it begins and ends.
So it's not just about Nevsun. It's about this bigger issue of companies operating in countries with weak governance and questionable human rights records.
That's the core of the problem, and this case really brings it to light.
It's a global issue, and it's something we need to be talking about.
Absolutely. And this case is a reminder that we can't just turn a blind eye to these injustices happening around the world.
Okay, so we've heard the workers' stories. We've seen the evidence. What happens now? I mean, the lawsuit was settled. Nevsun was acquired by Zijin Mining. The Bisha mine is still operating. Does any of this even matter anymore?
It absolutely matters. This case has already had a significant impact. Just the fact that it was allowed to proceed in a Canadian court set a precedent. Companies are now on notice that they can be held accountable for human rights violations even overseas.
So it's not just a symbolic victory,
Not at all. It's a real shift in the legal landscape when it comes to corporate responsibility.
and it's not just about legal accountability, right?
No, it's about raising awareness. It's about prompting a much-needed conversation about ethical sourcing and the true cost of our consumption habits.
Right, because we're all part of this system in a way.
We are, and this case shines a light on that uncomfortable truth.
So what can we do as individuals to make a difference? I mean, it can feel so overwhelming.
I hear you, but every choice we make, every purchase, every investment sends a signal to the market. When we support companies that prioritize ethical sourcing and human rights, we're not just buying a product.
We're making a statement.
Exactly. We're casting a vote for a more just and sustainable system.
So it's about being conscious consumers, doing our research, and voting with our wallets.
Yes, and it's about demanding more from our governments. We need stronger regulations and enforcement mechanisms to prevent these kinds of abuses in global supply chains.
Okay, so individual action, collective action, and systemic change all working together.
That's the recipe for real progress, and we can't let up the pressure.
So back to the Bisha mine. What's the situation there now? Did the acquisition by Zijin Mining change anything?
Well, that's where things get a little murky. We know they took over the mine, but the details of the acquisition and whether any liabilities related to the human rights allegations were transferred are unclear.
So we don't know for sure if Zijin Mining inherited any of the baggage from the Nevsun lawsuit.
Right, and that lack of transparency is concerning. It raises questions about whether anything has really changed at the mine in terms of labor practices and human rights.
It's like the cycle of exploitation continues just under a different name.
It's a possibility, and that's why ongoing scrutiny and accountability are so crucial.
So we can't just assume that a change in ownership means a change in practices.
Exactly. We need to keep asking those tough questions, demanding transparency and holding companies accountable regardless of who owns them.
Vigilance is key. It's like a never-ending battle.
In a way it is, but it's a battle worth fighting for.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So we've talked about the legal case, the worker testimonies, the corporate maneuvering. What about the victims? I mean, their stories are so powerful and disturbing. Was anyone ever held accountable for what happened at the Bisha mine?
That's a tough question, and the answer is not straightforward. The lawsuit was settled, but the terms of the settlement remain confidential. So we don't know for sure if any individuals or entities were held legally responsible.
So it's kind of a legal black box?
In a way, it is, and that can be frustrating. But it's important to remember that the fact that the case was allowed to proceed in a Canadian court and that Nevsun ultimately chose to settle even under confidential terms is significant.
So there's some measure of accountability, even if it's not fully transparent.
Exactly. It sends a message that companies cannot operate with impunity and that they can be held accountable for their actions even in far-flung corners of the world.
Okay, so while the legal outcome may be somewhat ambiguous, the broader impact of this case is undeniable.
Absolutely. It sparked a global conversation about corporate responsibility, forced labor, and the need for greater transparency in global supply chains.
And that conversation is still ongoing, right?
It is, and it's evolving. Consumers are becoming more aware and more demanding. Investors are starting to factor ESG criteria into their decisions, and governments are facing increasing pressure to enact stronger regulations.
So it feels like we're at a turning point.
I believe we are. The old ways of doing business are being challenged, and this deep dive into the Bisha mine is a microcosm of that larger shift.
It's a story about corporate greed, human suffering, and the fight for justice.
It is, but it's also a story about hope, about the power of individuals to make a difference, and about the potential for a more just and sustainable future.
Okay, that's a good note to end on. But before we officially wrap up, let's move on to our final thoughts.
Sounds good. Let's leave our listener with something to ponder.
So much to think about. I mean, we've gone from gold and silver to forced labor and international lawsuits. It's like a real-life thriller, you know?
It is, and it's a reminder that the things we buy, the resources we use, they often have these hidden costs, human costs that we don't always see.
Yeah, and it can feel kind of overwhelming. Like, how do we as individuals even begin to grapple with all of this?
It's true. It's a complex issue, but I think the first step is just awareness, educating ourselves about where our products come from, who made them, and under what conditions.
So it's about being informed consumers.
Exactly. And then we can make choices, support companies that are doing things the right way, that are prioritizing ethical sourcing and human rights.
So it's like voting with our wallets in a way.
It's about sending a signal to the market that we care about these things.
And it's not just about individual choices, right?
Mm.
I mean, we can also work together to demand change.
Absolutely. We can support organizations that are fighting for workers' rights. We can advocate for stronger government regulations, hold our elected officials accountable.
So it's like a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah,
Individual action, collective action, and then systemic change.
exactly. It all works together.
But let's bring it back to the human cost for a second. What can we do to make sure that the voices of those who suffered at the Bisha mine are not forgotten?
That's so important. We need to listen to their stories, share them, honor their courage in speaking out. And we can support organizations that are providing legal assistance and advocating for the rights of workers around the world.
So amplifying those voices, supporting those fighting for justice.
Yes, and demanding systemic change to prevent these kinds of abuses from happening in the future.
So the Bisha mine case, it's a reminder that these issues are real and that we all have a role to play in addressing them.
It's a call to action for all of us.
Well said. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
I agree. It's been quite a journey.
Yeah, a lot to think about. Thanks for joining me and for sharing your insights.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to everyone listening, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.